Okay. Hello, everybody. This is the second part of the lecture on analysis of style. And we ended up very briefly looking at the narrative of Balaam in Numbers 22. And the last thing we did was to look at repetition of certain words, particularly verbs that repeat over and over again in the narrative, signaling a certain importance in terms of how it brings out the theme in the narrative. And um, to continue, um, in terms of repetition, it has several functions when it happens within narrative. So you will have to look at repetition of terms, not just verbs, but you can also look at very important nouns. Not so much of the names, although sometimes uh, it happens. There are instances where the repetition of names would have, or at least the way they're arranged within the narrative, would have a significance in terms of how it is being used stylistically. Usually, when that happens, it's usually when um, like in the Judges 19 narrative, you can see how the appearances of the characters throughout each of the scene in the narrative would have a certain importance. So the way the the appearances of the characters, no, when they are allowed to speak up, especially would matter. Okay, but very often what we look at in terms of repetition when we consider it as a literary style in the narrative would be the action words, okay, and other nouns that may be able to bring out the theme, okay. So here, the repetitions would usually allow the establishment of unity. No? The very fact that it repeats over and over again would put the narrative together as a unified whole. It also would create expectancy because you're you're expecting something to happen if you've already noticed a certain repetition of action that is beginning to develop throughout the narrative. It also emphasizes main themes or significant development in the plot. And we will be looking at an example later on. In the instruction that I will be giving you before you are supposed to watch this video, you should have read Judges 13 until 16, which is really the story about Samson. Um, his birth, no, the annunciation to his parents up to the time when when he fails as the leader. Okay, repetition also gives insight into the nature of a character. uh, for example, it can signal additional point of view. So when a character repeats something that the narrator or another character said, it can definitely signal point of view. And sometimes it can, if a character does not repeat accurately what the narrator said or another character said, then that can tell you something about the characterization of a certain character. You know, it can reveal something about the nature of a character. And like I said, it signals the entrance of an additional point of view. Remember what happened in the Judges 19 and 20, where you have the report of the narrator versus the report of the Levite. And of course, it can have an entertainment value. You will see that later on. That repetition can actually add to the irony, the sarcasm, or the comedy aspect of the narrative. And it also can heighten suspense within the narrative because you're already expecting. By repetition, it allows you to expect something, no? And there are cases when the expectation will not follow through. No, the reverse of what you are expecting will actually happen. Okay. Now there are different kinds of repetition. The first one is something that we already looked at in the case of the Balaam narrative, which is the Leitwort. So this is a German term, which means a keyword or a word root which plays a central role in the development of the main theme. And as we have said in the Balaam story, the verb to see is definitely very central to the development of the theme, no? The ability to see and the inability to see, and the very fact that even the name or the role of Balaam really derives from the verb ra'ah, to see. No, it's the participle of ra'ah, so ro'eh is a seer. Okay, and in Lightbot, this can be the advantage of those who know a bit of Hebrew. In the Balaam story, uh, we saw that the verb does not change in form. Okay, if you actually try to trace the verb ra'ah, which is to see, in the entire narrative of Numbers 22, you will notice that it doesn't change in form. And so the translation value would be more or less the same um, throughout the narrative. However, this is not always the case um, in in narratives. And those of you who know Hebrew will know this, that sometimes you can have a different stem. Okay, so it can occur as kal, which is simply your simple active. Okay, but sometimes the same root or the same stem can occur the same root can occur in a different stem. It can be hifil, which is a which is an intensification of the original verb, so that when you translate it into English, you no longer say to see. Okay, you have to intensify it a bit, and sometimes you lose in the actual translation. You lose the original verb, no, because you have to account for the proper translation of the intensification of the verb. Okay, so for example, the verb to do, okay, which is asa in Hifil. So in Hebrew, it's the same root, no? When you intensify it, or when you make it causative in form, you can say to cause to do, or to maybe impel. Okay, so that can be the translation already in English. And if you're just reading it in English, you probably would have not noticed that this is actually the same verb root. Okay, which is very, very significant in the text. Now, of course, there's a way to go about this. What you just need to do is to review my lecture on word study, especially using the Step Bible. Because in the Step Bible, it has the English translation, but it allows you to look at the root for each of the words, especially the verbs in the English text. So it allows you to have an insight of what root it is using in the original Hebrew. So this will take a little bit of a work, but it's merely going through the English verbs and allowing Step Bible to bring out the root, and that will tell you if it's the same root. So it doesn't take a long time to be able to do that in Step Bible. So that is a tool that you can do. For those of you who know Hebrew and are using a software, of course, you just have to click on the root word and see where it occurs in that particular chapter. It's a little bit easier. At the same time, you know that when it changes in stem, so let's say it's originally Kal and then it became a Hifil, then you have to pay attention a little bit. The same is true in English. If you've noticed that it changed in form, maybe you should ask why. No, why? What is happening here? No, and we will be looking at the Sam. There's a change in the Samson in a word, a light bot in the Samson narrative, which can um, lead significantly to an understanding of what is going on in the text. So according to Martin Buber, lightbot is a word or linguistic root. I don't think he uses lightbot, no, but he gives a definition of this particular German word. So it is a word or linguistic root which recurs within the text. a series of text or a set of text in an extremely meaningful manner. So it's not random. No? It was very, very intentional that the author does it that way. It uses um, the same word over and over again. And in the case of Hebrew, you can change its form, okay, even if the same stem occurs over and over again. And that makes in that sense, that particular characteristic of the Hebrew language allows for the narrative to be using the same stem over and over again, but it doesn't become boring because the translation value changes over and over again. So you can have a different sense of the verb even if it's using the same root of the verb. So that when one investigates this repetition, the meaning of the text is explained or becomes clear to the reader. So when you probe it further, you will realize that it brings out a lot in terms of the meaning and the richness of the meaning in the text. Now, there are several kinds of repetition. Well, I will be pointing out two here. Um, the first one is the first one is Lightbot, no? The two other ones that we will be looking in the examples that will follow would be the sequence of actions and the type scenes. Now, the sequence of action is really where you will notice a pattern of three repeated actions. So you have something like 3+1, okay, or 2+1, with the third or the fourth acting as the climax or showing the reversal. So you have three series of action or four series of action with the last one having certain changes, okay? And sometimes the change can be a defiance of expectation. Now, the second one, this is actually the third one, the type scene, according to Alter, are recurrent narrative episodes which has set of predetermined motifs which occur in the crucial junctures in the lives of heroes, such as their birth, betrothal, and death. Now, in the type scene, both the narrator and the audience have certain expectations on how the narrative would progress, particularly because these type scenes would happen over and over again, not just in a book, but across the narrative in the Hebrew Bible. No, so we have incidents in the well, for example, in Genesis. No, you will see that the well is a recurrent motif, so it's a type scene. Or we have announcements of birth. No, we have different kinds of them within the Old Testament and even in the New Testament. So we will be looking at examples of this. Now, when a certain element is changed or suppressed, because these are type of scenes, so it forms a certain expectation from the readers in terms of the sequence of events that should happen. So when a certain element will change in a particular narrative, then you can see that as having a functional significance. Perhaps a very good example here would be when I compare the rape incident in Judges 19 and the Sodom and Gomorrah. I spent a little bit of time and space discussing that particular incident and how comparing them, showing points of similarity. And then I made a very, very strong exegetical point where they differ. And what is the significance of that difference? So using the Sodom incident as a type scene, I looked at where Judges 19 would establish a certain difference and how that particular difference will speak to the meaning of Judges 19. Okay, but we will be looking at the more common type scenes later on. Now, going back to Lightbot, Lightbot, no, I will not be spending so much time on this, although I've asked you to read Judges 13 to 16, the Samson narrative, particularly because this is what we did with the Balaam story, to look at the Lightbot within the narrative. But just to point out, in the Samson narrative, one of the recurring verbs there is yarad, or to go down, and the root word is there. For those of you who know Hebrew, it's yarad. So you see this occurring over and over again within the narrative. So in chapter 14, in several verses, you see Samson going down to Israelite territory. Okay. Now in 15, you don't see a rod, which is to go down. But there, Samson is described as going back and forth to Philistine territory, which is really similar to the use of Yarad in chapter 14. So when you are looking at light vote, you don't focus on the word itself, because sometimes the theme that the verb would denote might be expressed in other ways within the narrative. So just try to also be sensitive at how that particular theme will might occur in other parts of the narrative. So this theme of Yarad, or going down, okay, is denoting a spatial movement, no, a movement of the character, which is not just a movement geographically, but may also symbolize a movement away from national and religious identity as Yahweh's people. No, so Samson here, although he's a leader, is actually symbolizing that wandering away, the movement away of the nation as a whole from their identity as God's covenant people. Okay. Now in chapter 16, you will notice here that Yarad will take on a different stem, a different form, and it is Hifil. And the subject here, so there's a change in the use of the verb. The subject is the Philistines bringing him down to Gaza. Okay, so you have to take note of that. And what would that change imply in terms of the meaning making of Yarad, or even the meaning making of the narrative as a whole? And in 1631, you have the last occurrence of Yarad. It goes back to the original form, Kal, the simple active. And here, Samson's family went down, okay, in order to bring him up. So there's a different verb to denote the bringing up. It's Allah to Philistine territory, but it's the family this time. So it's no longer Samson going down or going back and forth to Philistine territory, but it's the family going down there to bring him up, okay, from Philistine territory. And it's actually the last part of it is some gives you, it's such a very profound profound scene in the narrative, considering that the majority of the Samson narrative, especially when he was already grown up, was a little bit of a comedy. There's entertainment value in terms of how the narrative was formulated. Okay, now this light boat of Yarad, you also see this in Jonah. Okay, going down to Nineveh, and then going down to the bottom of the ship, going down to the belly of it also repeats, no, this sense of going down. And you also will know, if you try to remember the narrative of Jonah. Although he was a prophet, he was in a sense trying to distance himself from God, no, and from the intentions of God. And you have that sense of, going down, moving away. No, and you see a spatial movement there, even that movement towards the bottom of the ship. But it can actually signal symbolically the theme of trying to move away, from God's intention. Okay, so there's a similarity there. Now, based on this light vote, now what makes this very important, aside from it brings out the very important themes within the narrative, based on this light vote, I can actually look at the structure of the Samson narrative. Okay, so that this is actually the structure that Dr. Athena followed. She did a lot of work on the Samson narrative, and she has in fact, well, her THM dissertation is on this one, and she has published, I think, several articles on the Samson narrative. So this is the structure that she is proposing. Well, one of the structures. If you remember, in the Judges 19, I also did there several structures, no, based on not just on scene, but based on words as well. No? So, and that's the reason why I particularly highlighted the Hebrew words in that in the structure to show the repetition of the words and of the themes as well. Okay. Now, so based on that, Yarad, you can structure the narrative of Samson in this way. So it comes in two parts. There's a journey to disequilibrium and then return to equilibrium. Okay, so you have from Israel to Philistia. You see here the notion of space. Now, this is where space becomes very relevant. Okay, from filial devotion to disaffection, from Yahweh's blessing to Yahweh's departure. So there's this very strong theme of this equilibrium there, the destruction of equilibrium. And then in the second part, there is a return to the equilibrium. Okay, so you have a return to Yahweh, and then return to kinship ties, and then you have the return to the geographic space, return to Israel. So you can see actually that there is a correspondence in the points here with the points in the second part. And you can almost, make an image, out of this, such that scholars say that this is a U-shaped structure. And it being U-shaped is actually one of the reasons why some scholars think of this particular narrative as a comedy. And it's a comedy not because it is funny all the time, but because it is U-shaped as a literature. Tragedy would be your inverted U-shape. No, so tragedy is you come from the bottom, you rise, 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 and then go back to the bottom. That's very tragic. In comedy, you start high, and then you go low, and then you go back to where you start again. No, so there's and if you actually look at the the um, the way the Samson narrative is constructed, there's some comedic elements, some funny comedic elements, but at the same time, it follows that particular U-shaped structure, where there is a return to where it began. So you go back in circles, you go around in circles only to return to the point where you actually began. Okay, that's the comedy aspect of it. Now, another light bot in the Samson narrative. So the light bot, you can see there earlier that it allows you to formulate that structure, which you can follow in your exegesis. And I want you again to try to revisit Judges 19 in terms of how powerfully the structure that I proposed there are several kinds of them, several levels of structuring. And it's not just because I wanted to point out how beautifully the Judges 19 was written, structurally, but how well those structures allows you to probe into the meaning of the text. So when we add a structure, it's not just because it's required or it makes, you have that very neat arrangement of elements of the narrative which you want to point out in your paper. Remember, you're trying to argue in your paper, and whatever you put there should really help you argue for the themes or the points that you want to argue for. So I want you to try to look at that again, because those different structuring, based on different elements in the text, really help bring out the meaning of the text. Now, going back to the Samson narrative, another light bot within it would be the higid, not which is to tell. Okay, this is actually the hifil form of I think this is nagad. Okay, to tell and not to tell. No, higid, lo higid. Okay, and then you have also the word yada, to know. So you have the repetition of yada or lo yada, not to know. Okay, so if you actually look at how it occurs so aside from yarad, you see these verbs occurring over and over again within the narrative. You see higid in the annunciation scene. Okay, And here it talks about, and it has yada as well. Okay, not to tell, not to know. And this one deals with the secret of the angel's identity. Okay, this is the annunciation to Manoah and his wife. Okay, this is the start of the Samson narrative. And then this will repeat again in the riddle incident in chapter 14. Okay, and this particular chapter talks about the secret of Samson's riddle, which eventually the Philistines will discover. And then the same two words will occur again in the Delilah episode in chapter 16. Okay, and I noted there the specific verses where they occur. And then here it talks about the secret of Samson's strength, no, in chapter 16, which Delilah uncovers. And then Samson did not know at first that the Philistines will succeed to strip him of his strength. Okay. And then the Yada will also occur in chapter 14, verse 4, which is a very difficult text in chapter 14. No? If you go back above, 14:4 is part of the riddle incident. No, there's a lot of riddles here, and let me just highlight that particular difficult text there. Judges 14:3-4. It says here, but his father and mother said to him, "Is there not a woman among your kin or among all our people that you must go to take a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines?" But Samson said to his father, "Go get her for me because she pleases me." And then you have here a parenthetical comment. Okay. His father and mother did not know that this was from the Lord, for he was seeking a pretext to act against the Philistines. Okay. At that time, the Philistines had dominion over the Israel. Now, the difficult part here, no, is that parenthetical comment. His father and mother did not know that this was from the Lord. What is from the Lord here? Is it talking about Samson's desire for the woman, or is it something else? Okay, no. Now, because this lecture is about light, but I will not go into the details of this. But if you look at the narrative, there is particularly this chapter. There is this series of secrets in the earlier on I pointed out chapter 14 as where you have all the riddles. So there's a series of secrets in this particular chapter, and these secrets are concealed and revealed. Okay, and here Samson and the Philistines were trying to know each other's secret, because information is power, like in our time. So they were trying to uncover each other's secret, because if they know the weakness of the other camp, then they would be able to overpower that particular camp. Now, what they did not know is that God also has a secret, and it's actually the ultimate secret within the narrative. Okay, and that his ultimate secret is that Samson is God's secret weapon against the Philistines. No, and it's not really the strength of Samson, which is the secret, but it is the very weakness of Samson that will eventually become an occasion. It will serve as a pretext to fight against the Philistines. No, so it defies expectation totally. Okay. So the turning point here would be the secret of Yahweh, no, in the to know Yada, no, that God knows something which even Samson would not know, no, and of course the Philistines did not know it, and they were in the eyes of Samson and the Philistines, they were trying to uncover, trying to look at where they are strong in order to overpower. No, but for Yahweh, the irony there is not the strength, no, but the weakness of Samson that will eventually become the God's secret weapon over the Philistines. Okay, so that's for light boat. Now, the second repetition is in the sequence of action. So if you're looking at repetition, it's not just the verbs or the repeating verbs, but you look at the repetition in terms of the sequence of action. Okay, so a very good example in the Samson narrative is you can break it down into 4 episodes. So you have the wedding feast and the riddle, killing with an ass jawbone. You have the prostitute in Gaza, and then you have Samson and Delilah. Now you will see here that there's actually a recurring pattern within these episodes. Okay, this pattern will occur over and over again within the episode. So the pattern is such that you have an actual or perceived advantage on Samson's part, and the Philistines will attempt to gain advantage through deception. Okay, and then the Philistines' scheme will prosper, and it will look like they are winning over Samson. And then the last part of the pattern is when the Philistines think that they have finally captured Samson, Samson will escape from their trap and turns the table against them. So this pattern will occur over and over again now within this episode. However, in the last one, in the fourth one, um, the pattern will change. Okay, it will not follow now this predetermined pattern. So the fourth one will become the turn of the narrative, because in the fourth one, Samson will not be able to escape the trap. No, they will actually be able to capture him. Okay, so you have to try to look at this repeated sequence of actions that is not necessarily denoted by the same verb, no, but you can discern it from how the narrative will actually progress. And this is again where you have to have a sensitivity in terms of the structure. You can see here that this is based on the structure and based on the delineation of the episode, you will notice that there is a sequence of action that repeats over and over again. Okay, and this actually the repetition here, especially in the Philistines trying to determine the weakness of Samson. It's a little bit funny. It's like a slapstick comedy. No, I don't know how how young are you or how old you are, but there was during my younger years, there's this comedy of the Three Stooges where they hit each other. They just keep hitting each other. It's so funny, and then there is mayhem in the end. No, so here you will. So there's a repetition of hitting each other, and then the pattern collapses at the end. So it's the same here. No, there's entertainment in the repetition of this pattern in what's going on with Samson. No, they're trying to determine Samson's weakness, and it will appear like they're gaining advantage, and it will appear like they will win over Samson. And then, Samson escapes. No, it becomes funny. It becomes particularly funny because it repeats 3 times. No, but in the fourth one, it fails. So there's a collapse in terms of the pattern there. Okay, so try to notice things like this as well in terms of repetition. The other repetition that you see in the Samson narrative, you can also look at it through the this particular way of dividing the structure. No, so you have an inclusion. Episode 1 corresponds with episode 3, and here it talks about very, very specific characters. No, so from 14 to chapter 15, you have the team night. Episode 2 is sandwich. It's very brief. It's just 3 verses. It's the Gaza prostitute, and then 3 is Delilah. No, and again, this is from the work of Dr. Athena, and you've seen that she's done very significant work on this one, and that's the reason why she can point out as many structures as possible. In the same way that I've done some work on Judges 19, and so several structures came out. But here, even in the inclusion, you will see a little bit of pattern. No? Each of these episodes will commence with Samson's travel to the Philistines' territory. Okay, so dividing the narrative this way, you see a certain repeated movement, no, the traveling of Samson, uh, and also the theme of concealment and revelation of the secret will be a major theme, especially in episode 1 and episode 3. Okay, but even if you disregard that, you will see the pattern of the movement in these 3 episodes. Okay. Okay. Now here, you in this particular structure, you again see sequence of actions in Judges 14 to 16. So you have there the first enticement, the second enticement, the third enticement, and the fourth enticement. Oh, this is just chapter 16. No, sorry, I just copied the heading up there, but this is just chapter 16. And if you look at this particular chapter, you will also see a certain pattern in terms of the dialogue that occurs over and over again in each of these enticement episodes. Okay, so you will see Delilah trying to entreat um entreat Samson. She would say, please tell me. Okay, please tell me. Okay. Um, and then some you will have Samson's response, which is again a direct speech, where he pretends to reveal the secret of his strength, and it has to do with a form of binding. If you tie me, this is what happens. And Delilah will enact the action. But at the end, Samson will free himself uh, from his bonds. No, so this repeats over and over again. And like I said, you will see this better again if you structure the narrative. No, and this is already, I think, the fourth structure that we have shown in terms of showing that repeated sequence of action. However, you will notice here that in the last one, in the fourth and final enticement, the pattern will change. No, the pattern will change. Delilah becomes frustrated and says, "How can you say I love you when your heart is not with me?" No. So he gives him his whole heart. He tells him his whole secret. No, the way the Hebrew is expressed here is as if Samson is showing his entire heart to Delilah. So here you see this pattern which I have mentioned earlier. It's sometimes 2+1 or 3+1. So you have 2+1, so 2 or 3, in order to heighten that expectation. You're expecting and expecting that it happens over and over again. And in the last one, no, it just the pattern just breaks down. In fact, this kind of pattern you can actually, if we spend a little bit more time on the Balaam narrative, you will also be able to see it there. Okay, so here in this particular structure, sorry, in the sequence of action, the last part is the theme of concealment. No, it's no longer Samson trying to hide and trying to free away. No, it's like he's tricking Delilah, trying to keep her to stay, no, until Delilah gets frustrated. And the last one will break that expectation so that the theme there is a theme of concealment. Okay. So yeah, you in the fourth one you still have please tell me. But in the end, Delilah will say, "How can you say this? No, how can you say that you love me when your heart is actually not with me?" So he shows him his heart. Okay. So those are repetition in terms of action, and you can see that in just one narrative, there's a lot of repetition that is going on. You have verbal repetition, the light vote. You have a sequence of actions that happens over and over again. Now let's go to the type scene, which is another kind of repetition as well. And there are examples of type scenes that we find in Hebrew narrative or Old Testament narrative. We have the Annunciation, which is the announcement of birth. You have the birth story, wherein you see threats to newborn. Um, and then you have encounter at the well, which I mentioned earlier, leading to betrothal. If you remember Jacob and Rebecca, no, and there's an article I think by Sternberg entitled "The Wooing at the Well." Okay, and then you have the call of a messenger or a deliverer, the initiation of a hero, where the hero goes through some trial, and then the death of the hero. Now, these are type scenes because they occur um, repeatedly across different narratives. No, so for example, in the Annunciation, so when we say type scenes, you have here recurring narratives which already have predetermined motifs. Okay, um, you are, because they are so typical, you expect something. For example, in the case of Annunciation, you have there, the typical there is you have the sense of barrenness, and then you have divine promise of the future, and then you have uh, conception, no? The divine promise, of course, is the promise of the eventual conception, and then you have the birth of the son. Okay, and a very good example of this one actually is Judges, the story of Samson, wherein the Annunciation is in Judges 13. So you have an angel coming to announce. And there are other narratives in the Old Testament. No, Samuel, there is uh, his mother was barren. And so there's a promise of a divine conception, and then eventually the birth of Samuel. Also, Isaac, no, is a type of Annunciation. Okay, and normally, if the son will have in this type scene, usually the son will have a significant role in the future. And in fact, no, the birth of the life of Jesus, the Annunciation of the birth of Jesus follows this pattern in a way, this type scene, except that Mary is not barren. No, there's a different change there. Mary is a virgin, at least in the New Testament conception, but still it follows uh, this expectation of predetermined motives within the narrative. Okay, and then in the birth story, you have threats to the newborn. Now we see that not just in the Old Testament, but you have it in the New Testament as well. Remember the story of Herod? No, that's a type scene as well. And then a very nice type scene is the encounter at the well, no, where it leads to betrothal, and of course, the Rebecca and Jacob story is part of this. Aside from that, the well is also definitely a very significant um, significant place, no, in the encounters, especially in the Genesis narrative. No? So that's something that you can also look at in terms of um, space, no, the relevance of space. So how is the well significant in the story, especially if it figures in the story. Now in the type scene of the encounter in the well, uh, this, if you actually go to the New Testament, the one that would be closest to this is Jesus' encounter with a Samaritan woman. No, this particular incident evokes the type scene in the Old Testament. However, it takes it to a different direction altogether. No, but you can see there that the way it's formed really evokes the type scene in the Old Testament. Okay. So we also have that call of a messenger or a deliverer, no? And here you can maybe look at the call of Moses, no, or the call of Gideon, the call of Jeremiah, which occurs in the prophetic material, and it's actually narrative. It's prose rather than poetry. Okay, so when you look at this particular type scene, you have to. So there's an expected play out of events or expected motifs that will come out. What you should try to look at is the change in the pattern. So if you were to compare the call of Moses and the call of Gideon, there's an expected structure, no? If it's a call narrative, there's usually a theophany, the appearance of God, or sometimes the appearance of God's glory. And then there's a call, and then there's an objection to the call, and there's a sign given, and then eventually there's an acceptance. Now, if you look at the Moses narrative, the objection there is very long. So the narrator will spend a significant amount of time highlighting the objection of Moses. versus the call of Gideon, where the affirmation and the confirmation is very long. So there's much more space there. So if you're looking at this type scene, if you realize that what you are dealing with in the narrative is a repetition of a type scene that you see in the Old Testament, you have to ask yourself why the difference. Why is the difference occurring in the particular portrayal of that type scene in the narrative? So this is the same as what I did with Judges 19, no, and the rape incident. I highlighted where it differed and why that difference matters, no. So why is the affirmation very long in the case of the Gideon narrative, whereas in the Moses narrative, the 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 longer part there is the objection. Okay, and then you can look at the other type scenes as well. I think there are literatures that talks about this type scene, so you can go to this literature and look at what you should be expecting and see how the particular narrative that you're dealing with defies that particular expectation. Okay, so those are the cases of your repetition. Now let's go to irony. So irony um, is a conflict marked by the perception of distance between pretense and reality. No, it is a figure of speech of which the literal meaning of the word is opposite of its intended meaning. No, for example, I could care less. And this is a literary technique for implying through the plot or the character that the actual situation is quite different from that which is presented. Okay. Now, the difficulty with irony is that the actual meaning is not what is the literal meaning. No. And irony can sometimes be very culture bound. So, for example, um, Americans have a different humor. No, British, in fact, the Brits, no, their jokes are in the form of irony. So when you say that to an American, they would not easily get it. No? My supervisor, who is North American, but has worked extensively in the UK because he studied in Oxford. Was telling me about how initially when he arrived in the UK during his student days, he could not get he didn't realize that his supervisor, who is John Bart, one of the major Old Testament figures, no, in scholarship in general, uh, was already making a joke, no, because he's North American, and the Brits, when they say their joke, it's they don't laugh, they don't appear like they're laughing, no, because it comes in the form of irony. Okay, so this can be very much culture bound, and sometimes you have to be very very sensitive to the Hebrew culture in order to actually try to look at the irony that is being highlighted in the text. So irony always features an incongruity between words and their meaning, no, because the meaning is always opposite what is said. And it can be used as a form of critique or protest since it shows the distance between what is and what ought to be. And we see this a lot right now when people express their frustration in social media, especially in terms of political events. No, sometimes when you're reading it, if you don't know the person very well, you might think that he is pro this position, and without realizing that he's actually being sarcastic, no, and there's irony in what he's saying. What he is saying is not what he means, no, but the opposite of what he means is the opposite of what he's saying. Okay, now an ironic tale may lead them to better self-recognition, uh, the readers and the characters, and rather than straight reproof, no, because when you say it in a discourse type, the especially if it's a very difficult idea to accept, the audience may be resistant to direct indictments, no. So the way you say it is in an ironic way, no. And even in the prophetic material, where most of the time it's direct reproof, there are levels of irony that you can detect there as well, okay, in the poetry there. So, because this is culture bound, there is, of course, a danger of the message becoming completely lost in translation, especially if the audience misses out on the irony. So, in the same way that sometimes, if you don't know the person posting um, in social media and you just assume that what he is saying there is the literal meaning, you might misconstrue what he means, no? And you end up labeling that person or judging him without realizing that he is actually in the same side as you are. Okay, because what he is writing is the opposite of what he really means. But sometimes because you're frustrated or you want to accentuate the point, no? Like a friend of mine earlier on was posting about all this fake news about politics, no? And I think he was so frustrated that he started saying, "Oh, here's your news for today." Especially, the Marcos gold bars, no, and he posted something about where this came from, no, about a he posted a YouTube story about where the riches came from, and the YouTube story talks about the gold bars. And he was being very sarcastic and ironic about it. And he said, "Oh, I love this story. This is, the best story that I've read today. It's very, very enlightening." No? And if you don't know him, and true enough, there are people who don't know him very well who are actually his friends. You can see it from their comments. No, they were trying to reprove him. They were trying to say, that's fake news. That's fake news. But I know he's kind. I know that he is very frustrated. So I was very entertained looking at the exchanges, because instead of correcting them immediately, he even he even played around played even more with what they were posting in the comment section of his post. It was only very later when he said, Did you not did you not catch, the irony that I was trying to point out?" Okay. Now, in narratives, there are different kinds of irony. Well, in this particular image, which I got from the internet, it only points to three, but I will be talking about four. So you have verbal irony, situational irony, dramatic irony, and then there's narrative irony. So let's look at the first one, the rhetorical or verbal irony. Okay, so this is based on what is said, based on words. So what is stated is opposite what is being said or meant. And like I said earlier, this can be used as a form of indirect critique. Because this can be very, very sarcastic in order to point out the irony. So, for example, a very good example here is the Deuteronomistic phrase, "There is no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes." Okay. Now, if you read this apart from the context, it might appear like, okay, they were doing. There was no king in Israel, no, and despite that, they were doing what was right, no, in their own eyes, assuming that they are, righteous people. Okay. But in a way, this is being used ironically in the passage, no, because it means the opposite of the literal. If you take it out from the context, if you don't know the story of Judges, you would think that this is a positive thing, no, but it is not. And what becomes more ironic is this is actually the reason why it's called a Deuteronomistic phrase. Is it's a phrase that was added when the materials, the stories were collected later on during the exilic period. So this is from the hand of the Deuteronomistic editor who was in exile. So he, or well, maybe the community, if it's a community who was putting together the stories, they put in this phrase in order to make a nice transition between the stories, no? And so remembering that they were already in exile, they did not have any king. Okay, in fact, they had kings, but it failed. No, it did not really. The monarchy did not really, you know, did not really did not reach as was as what was expected of it. No, it did not perform as what they were hoping for it to do. No, and there's irony there. No, because they you have to remember that these materials was like a review of the past. And why were they reviewing? No, why were they reviewing? So there's a political reflection there, from the perspective of those who were in exile. Okay, so that's verbal irony. The next one is the dramatic irony, and this one occurs in when the reader knows more than the characters in the story. Okay, in the image, it says here, dramatic irony occurs in everyday life when a situation is happening, and yet the person within the situation is unaware of what is happening. No, so for example, Haman in the story of Esther. No, he was so happy that he got invited into the feast, so he went through all this preparation, thinking that Esther will, honor him. No, and he doesn't know, no, that behind it there is a plot to disempower him. And in fact, in the last banquet, no, in the he that was when it was declared that he will be killed, or he will be hanged in the same gallows that he prepared for Mordecai. Okay, um, to a certain extent, Abraham in Genesis 22 is also a case of irony. Okay, because he doesn't know. If you remember, if you look at it from the perspective of point of view, the reader knows more than Abraham in that story, and because the reader knows more, and Abraham doesn't know the plan, no, it becomes an irony, no, because he doesn't know how things are gonna play out. So he was just a character who was going through the story, going through the motions, and in the end, there was a surprise there. Okay, so there's an irony there. Now, the next one is what we call a situational irony. And this is when the situation is opposite of what is expected or what is appropriate. Okay. And this is used as a literary device to refer to situations pertaining to what is expected to happen against what actually happens, no? Vis-a-vis what happens. And the irony here will lie with the expectation of the outcome of the situation, when in reality, something completely different occurs. No? So, for example, the Levite in Judges 19, you would be expecting that he is the one who would, being a Levite, um, he is a model of morality. Um, and that's the reason why the Levite, no, his role there is very crucial. Why did they not use a different man instead for that particular story? Or King David in the Bathsheba incident, no, he was king. Uh, and the way he is formed, the characterization is very good, no. But here, the opposite of the situation is what is going to happen. Or Manoah in Judges 13, no. If you look at the expectation of men in 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 the Old Testament world, they are the ones who are supposed to be sensitive to divine knowledge, no. And so in Manoah's narrative in Judges 19, there is the yada, to know and not to know. No, but here the irony there is it's the wife who knows. It's not Manoah. Okay, uh, maybe a very good example of types of this kind of irony, situational irony in the New Testament, is the parable of the Good Samaritan. Okay, you would be expecting that the people who knew the law, who are supposed to be well versed in terms of moral instructions, are the ones who would be able to interpret the situation very well and to respond to it accordingly. But in the end, the Samaritan, no, who is a despised and in fact not considered member of the chosen covenant community, is the one who responds well, no. So there's irony there, because the one who is not expected to respond is the one who responded. And it's the way it is framed in the way it's framed in the parable of the Good Samaritan. It really uses the irony there very, very powerfully. It will really hit you hard if you realize what a Samaritan is, in contrast with all the characters that actually came before him, no, and failed to perform as they were expected to perform based on the expectation of their roles. Okay, now the last one is what we would call narrative irony, and this is when an author distances himself from his characters and makes them do ridiculous things. And this really can have, entertainment value, because the characters are, allowed or prodded to do ridiculous things in order to expose them to derision, especially from the perspective of the reader. Okay, so a very good example here is Jonah when he protested before God. Him, and that's why you have that image there of him sitting in the under the vine, no? Or Nebuchadnezzar when he paid homage to Daniel, no? So here there is also a the author tries to distance himself from the character, okay? And Nebuchadnezzar, who was supposed to be, that honorable man, is made to do very ridiculous things, no? Given that he is the king, and Daniel is supposed to be paying homage to him, but the contrast or the reverse of it actually happens. Okay, so you have these elements of style that are in narratives. There are more, and uh, I will be posting some readings that might highlight them, but we have to be, when we talk about style, you have to be very sensitive at the literary techniques, the other literary techniques that are employed by the writer or the narrator in order to highlight points within the narrative and make the reader get engaged even more. Okay, and when we talk about style, this is beyond characterization or your usual uh, analytical elements, no, point of view, although they would overlap, no, but these are the other stylistic elements within the literature that allows you to be more engaged, and at the same time allows the text to highlight meaning and to highlight certain themes within the text. So the good thing is, like I said, with any exegetical skill, you get better over time. No? The more you read narratives and the more you engage other scholars, the more you become very sensitive to these things. And the key here, again, of course, is close reading of the text. Now, you don't notice these styles immediately unless you do a proper close reading. No, if you remember what I pointed out earlier in terms of the repetition shown in the different structures of the text, it's not, you don't structure the text at a very sophisticated way with just one reading of the text. Maybe you can come up with a structure, but it's usually an episodic structure or a scenic structure. No, the more elaborate structure within the text come out even more when you spend a very close reading of the text. Okay, so I will be posting an exercise on style that you will be doing along with your group mates, and I will see you by next week.